Okay, let's unpack this. Think about how much of our lives is shaped by predictions. The weather forecasts, stock market
Yeah,
trends.
even movie recommendations?
Exactly. But now imagine using data for predictions where the stakes are just incredibly high. Predicting serious health outcomes, maybe, or analyzing risks that could lead to disaster.
Mm-hmm. That's really the territory we're exploring today.
Right.
This deep dive is centered on how these data science models are actually built to predict things. And specifically, the fundamental difference between predicting, say, a number versus predicting a category or some kind of outcome.
And our sources for this journey, they give us the essentials. We've got material laying out the core concepts, the different types of problems.
Right, yeah.
And then crucially, two incredibly powerful real-world examples. One from public health, a really long-running effort.
And the other from a really pivotal, kind of tragic moment in space exploration history.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to sort of cut through the details, pull out the main ideas behind prediction using data science, and see how these techniques, specifically regression and classification, have given us insights with, well, profound real-world impact. We want to extract the knowledge that's truly useful and hopefully memorable for you.
All right, let's dive into the basics then. Prediction.
At its core, yeah, building a predictive model is about using past data to anticipate something in the future.
Simple enough sounding.
Well, the very first step, really, in framing a prediction problem is deciding what kind of thing you're trying to predict.
And that what kind of thing creates this fundamental split, doesn't it, in the world of predictive modeling? Are you trying to predict a number, or are you trying to predict which group or type something belongs to?
Exactly that. If your target is a numerical value, maybe, projected sales for next quarter, the temperature tomorrow, perhaps the number of hospitalizations from some virus next month, you're dealing with a regression problem.
Okay.
Your outcome is quantitative. It's a number.
So a number is regression. Got it. And if you're trying to sort things into bins or categories, like, will this customer click buy?
Yeah, or is this email spam or not?
Or, based on a machine's sensor data, is it likely to fail soon?
That's your classification problem. Here, the outcome is qualitative or categorical. You're essentially assigning an item to one of several predefined classes.
Okay. Predict a number. Regression. Predict a category. Classification.
Mhm.
And our sources point out that different types of models, different algorithms are typically better suited for one or the other, right? Though some can apparently do both.
That's right. Like, linear regression is often a go-to for numerical predictions.
Okay.
Whereas logistic regression is very commonly used for classification, especially when you want to predict a probability.
Ah, probability. Interesting.
And yeah, then you have others like decision trees or random forests, which are quite versatile. They can handle both types of problems.
Got it. Okay, so you've built a model. Now what? You immediately run into the next critical question, which is it any good?
Exactly. And what does good even mean for a predictive model?
Because that's where it gets really interesting, isn't it? You can build a model that makes predictions, sure, but is it useful?
Right. Does it actually help you make better decisions or achieve some real-world goal, like reducing risk or improving patient outcomes?
Yeah.
Precisely. Our sources bring up that famous quote. You often hear it attributed to the statistician George Box. All models are wrong, but some are useful.
I like that.
It's such a grounding idea. Your model is never a perfect copy of reality. It can't be.
Right.
But it can still provide immense value if it's useful for what you intended it for.
And because no model is perfect, you can't just, slap one together and trust it blindly. You've got to evaluate it rigorously.
It definitely.
So how do you even measure how useful a model is?
Well, you measure its performance using specific metrics. And there isn't just one magic number, usually.
Okay.
You typically look at several different metrics to get a fuller picture, often averaging results across different tests or parts of your data.
So for regression problems, where we're predicting those numbers, what kind of metrics are we talking about?
There, you're often looking at metrics that tell you, sort of on average, how far off your predicted numbers are from the actual numbers.
Makes sense?
Things like mean squared error, MSE, or root mean squared error, RMSE. These tend to penalize larger errors more heavily.
Okay.
Then there's mean absolute error, MAE, which measures the average size of the errors without squaring them.
Right.
And R squared, R rogue way. That gives you an idea of how much of the variation in the outcome your model actually explains.
Okay, so those give you a sense of the numerical accuracy, how close you are. What about for classification problems, where you're sorting things into categories?
Right. Here, you're more concerned with how well your model correctly assigns items to their categories,
Okay.
and importantly, where it makes mistakes.
The mistakes matter.
They really do. Metrics like precision and recall are key. Precision tells you about the quality of your positive predictions when you said, yes, how often were you right? And recall tells you how many of the actual positives you managed to capture.
Got it.
And the sources highlight the area under the ROC curve, or AUC, as a particularly famous metric for classification.
AUC.
Yeah, it provides a single score that summarizes a model's ability to distinguish between the classes across different probability thresholds. It's quite powerful.
So we define the problem, regression, or classification. We build a model, and then we use these specific metrics to figure out if that model is actually useful for our goal.
Exactly. That's the basic flow. So with that foundation, let's look at how these concepts have played out in some incredibly impactful real-world scenarios.
Okay, let's do it. Our first case study takes us into public health, specifically heart disease, through the lens of the Framingham Heart Study. And the sources open this story with a really powerful image. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's blood pressure readings over time.
It's quite a stark illustration, isn't it? His blood pressure just climbed dramatically in the years leading up to his death. And this was happening at a time when, believe it or not, there was even this old myth floating around that high blood pressure might actually be good for you.
Really beneficial.
Yeah, the idea was maybe it helped blood flow better. A really dangerous idea, obviously, that we know today is completely false.
Wow. So how did we get from that kind of dangerous misconception to our modern understanding of heart disease risk factors?
Well, that's largely the legacy of the Framingham Heart Study. It began way back in 1948 in Framingham, Massachusetts.
1948.
And remarkably, it is still collecting data today.
Still going.
Yeah.
After all those decades. That's incredible dedication.
It really is. It started with over 5,000 participants. They were examined, filled out questionnaires every 2 years.
Okay.
And researchers have just been digging into that incredibly rich data set ever since, trying to understand what causes cardiovascular disease. The sources are very clear. This data is analyzed to save lives.
And how does data science, how does predictive modeling fit into that Framingham story?
Well, the question of predicting whether someone will develop heart disease, that's framed as a classification problem.
Ah, classification again.
Yes. The goal is to predict if a participant is likely to experience coronary heart disease, CHD, in the next 10 years. That's a yes-no outcome, a category. It's often represented by a variable called 10-year CHD in the datasets you see.
And the sources specifically highlight using logistic regression for this task.
Yes, logistic regression is a really good fit here because it doesn't just predict the category, yes or no.
Yeah.
It actually outputs the probability that someone will develop CHD.
Ah, the probability. That seems key.
It is key. Knowing that probability lets doctors and patients understand their risk level quantitatively, not just as a binary thing.
So when you build a model like this on the Framingham data, what insights does it actually give you? What does the model reveal?
Well, it helps quantify the impact of different health factors. The model assigns these things called coefficients to variables like blood pressure, cholesterol levels, smoking status, age, and so on.
Coefficients, like weights.
Sort of, yeah. A positive coefficient means that factor increases the likelihood of 10-year CHD. A negative one means it decreases it.
Okay.
And the sources mention tools like a nomogram. It's essentially a visual chart built from the model.
A chart.
Yeah, it helps you easily see a person's predicted risk based on their individual combination of factors.
And what's the most critical question the sources say this kind of analysis helps answer?
It's about identifying the factors you can actually do something about.
Ah.
The question is framed as, what are the influenceable risk factors that we can affect? Understanding that, say, high blood pressure or high cholesterol significantly increases risk, and that these are things you can manage through lifestyle or medication, that's a monumental insight.
Absolutely. And you'd evaluate this Framingham model using those classification metrics we talked about earlier, like AUC.
Absolutely. Metrics like AUC would show how well the model distinguishes between people who will and won't get CHD over the next 10 years.
And you mentioned mistakes.
Yes, looking at something called a confusion matrix would be crucial. It shows you exactly where the model is making mistakes.
Like predicting someone is fine when they're not.
Exactly. Predicting someone won't get heart disease when they actually, well, that's often called a type 2 error or a false negative.
Yeah.
That's a very serious mistake in this context, right?
Yeah, you'd miss a chance to intervene.
Precisely. Understanding these error types helps refine the model, maybe adjust its threshold, and guides how its predictions are actually used in practice.
The impact of the Framingham study, when you lay it out like that, it's truly staggering. It feels like it fundamentally changed medicine.
It really did. The data provided absolutely essential evidence needed to prove the effectiveness of blood pressure-lowering drugs. Remember, they were too toxic in FDR's time.
Right.
But Framingham helped validate the benefits of safer alternatives later on. That paved the way for a market that's now worth over $1 billion.
And statins. I know those are huge for cholesterol.
Yes, the data heavily supported the development and adoption of statins, starting back in the 1970s.
Wow.
The sources cite these studies showing really dramatic risk reductions, like a 37% reduction in the risk of a second heart attack for people who'd already had one,
37%.
and a 32% reduction in cardiovascular disease death for men who just had high cholesterol. That's the power of evidence-based prediction guiding treatment decisions.
Incredible.
The statin market now, over $20 billion. But the real impact, obviously, is in the lives saved and the quality of life improved.
It's just amazing that a study started decades ago has generated data used in, over 2,500 studies. And it's still shaping how we understand health. It really moved us from guesswork, maybe, to data-driven prediction and intervention.
It's a real testament to the value of long-term data collection and, crucially, applying rigorous predictive analysis to it.
Okay. So from saving lives through these long-term health insights, let's pivot to our second case study. This one highlights the importance of prediction, or maybe the lack of timely prediction, in a very different kind of high-stakes scenario. A historical tragedy.
Right. We're talking about the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster in 1986.
Yeah.
It exploded just 73 seconds after launch. A truly devastating moment for NASA, for everyone watching.
And this case is really striking because of the data context at that specific moment of the launch decision. What did they not have clear data on?
Well, they didn't have specific data on how the crucial O-ring seals, these rubber rings in the rocket boosters, would perform under the specific, unusually cold conditions of that particular launch day.
Right, it was very cold.
Extremely cold for Florida. There was pressure to launch, schedules to keep, and the data available at the time didn't definitively scream, "Estapi." It was ambiguous.
And this is the key point the sources make. What data did they have?
Exactly. They did have data from all the previous shuttle launches.
The historical data.
Right. This historical operational data contained crucial information, even if it wasn't analyzed in the right way beforehand.
And this is where data science provides such a powerful, albeit retrospective, lesson. How can predictive analysis be applied to that historical Challenger data?
Well, you can frame it as another classification problem.
Okay.
Based on the conditions of a previous launch, specifically the temperature at launch, did a critical O-ring component experience damage or erosion? Sometimes they called it a break.
So you take the data from all the successful launches, plus maybe those where they found some O-ring damage after the fact.
Exactly. And you build a model. You explore the relationship between temperature and O-ring issues. That's the exploratory data analysis, or EDA part.
And then maybe build a logistic regression model, just like with Framingham.
You could, yeah, and you'd evaluate its quality using those classification metrics. But the critical point the sources drive home is this. If such a model had been built and used proactively on that historical data,
what would it have told them?
What would it have predicted about the risk on that specific cold launch day?
It could have predicted the probability of an O-ring failure or damage at that specific, very cold temperature, like the 36 degrees Fahrenheit mentioned in the source material as being relevant that day.
And that's the chilling insight, isn't it? The data was there, hidden in the records of previous flights.
Yeah.
Analyzing it predictively, using something like logistic regression, could potentially have revealed a significant quantifiable risk associated with those cold temperatures. A risk that just wasn't fully appreciated or perhaps wasn't communicated effectively enough in the decision to launch.
So the Challenger case becomes this profound, really tragic illustration of the potential cost when critical operational data isn't systematically analyzed to identify risks before crucial decisions are made, rather than just studied intensely in hindsight after something goes wrong.
It absolutely underscores the value of turning historical performance data into predictive insights.
Right.
Especially when safety is paramount.
So we've journeyed through the fundamentals then. How data science builds these predictive models, understanding that key split between predicting numbers regression and predicting categories classification.
Right. And stressing why evaluating a model's usefulness with those metrics is just so important. It's not enough to just build a model.
And we've seen these concepts really come to life through two incredibly powerful case studies. The Framingham Heart Study, showing how decades of data analysis transformed medical understanding, predicting health risks, and leading to life-saving interventions.
And then the Challenger disaster, a much more somber reminder, but equally important, about the potential for predictive analysis on historical operational data to illuminate critical risks before tragedy strikes.
Yeah. Whether it's applying models to population health data that spans generations or scrutinizing the performance data from complex engineered systems, these data-driven approaches are giving us unprecedented power to understand risks and anticipate potential futures.
They really move us beyond just intuition or limited personal experience towards genuinely evidence-based prediction.
And remembering that phrase, all models are wrong, but some are useful, we've seen just how useful they can be. But especially when lives or safety are potentially on the line, what are the crucial questions we absolutely must always be asking about any prediction we receive from a model?
That's such a critical point. You really need to think about the data the model was trained on.
Okay.
Is it truly representative of the situation you're trying to predict now? Are there biases in that historical data that might skew the prediction?
Biases. Good point.
And don't just look at the overall accuracy score. Look at the types of mistakes the model makes. Remember that confusion matrix?
Yeah, the false positives, false negatives.
Exactly. Those false negatives, like missing a heart disease case or underestimating O-ring failure risk, can have drastically different consequences than false positives. You need to ask, what are the real-world consequences of these specific kinds of errors?
So the prediction itself is a tool, maybe a very useful tool, but understanding its limitations, the biases it might have inherited from the data it learned from, and its potential failure modes. That's just as important as getting the prediction itself.
Absolutely. It gives you a much clearer picture of whether that useful model is truly reliable and trustworthy in the specific moment you need to depend on it most.
Something definitely worth considering with every prediction you encounter.